Welcome, friends, to History and Ashes, the place where the past flickers back to life, even when the details feel slow, dusty, and half forgotten. Tonight, or whatever quiet moment you have chosen to listen, we are stepping carefully into one of the strangest things in all of ancient history. The simple fact that entire Egyptian dynasties, whole ruling families with palaces, treasuries, titles, servants, and years of reign vanished from memory. Not gradually, not politely, but almost as if a heavy desert wind swept them away and left barely a shard behind. There are records where the Egyptians listed their kings proudly, one after another, and right in the middle of what should be an unbroken line, there is an emptiness. In some cases, the names were scratched out deliberately. In others, the space is simply blank, as if no one wished to remember who ruled during those years. And what might be the most unsettling detail is that this was not the work of invaders or natural disasters alone. Sometimes it was their own descendants who quietly erased them, leaving historians thousands of years later staring at careful, structured lists with entire branches missing. Before we go further and uncover these gaps, the forgotten rulers, the mistakes in the king lists, and the faint traces of dynasties lost to sand and silence, could you do something small for us? If you have a moment, slip down to the comments and tell us where you are listening from and what time it is for you. We always find it oddly comforting to imagine these ancient stories floating across oceans and time zones, reaching people sitting under blankets or on late-night walks. And while you are there, please subscribe to History and Ashes. If ancient Egyptians could carve their devotion into stone blocks weighing thousands of pounds, surely you can press one little button for us. Without your support, this channel will fade away faster than one of those erased dynasties, just a lonely line of digital hieroglyphs with no one left to read them. Now, let us step back into the calm sands of deep history, where most things happen slowly, quietly, and without the drama that modern imaginations often attach to ancient Egypt. When we talk about lost dynasties, it is important to remember that the Egyptians themselves valued order above almost everything. Their world revolved around the idea of ma'at, not in a poetic way, but in a very practical, administrative sense. Lists were made carefully, taxes were counted tediously, rations were recorded precisely. So when a dynasty vanished from memory, it was not because Egyptians were careless. It meant something had gone genuinely wrong. One of the earliest shocks historians encountered came from the Abydos king list, carved during the reign of Seti I. It was meant to be a grand and tidy record, showing how the kingship passed smoothly from one ruler to the next. But when researchers compared it to other sources, they found that many names were simply absent, not with notes or explanations, just skipped. Dynasties we know existed from archaeology are treated as though they had never ruled. Some scholars believe the omissions were deliberate, meant to create a cleaner, more legitimate history for the ruling family of the time. But even deliberate omissions speak to something deeper. Those rulers had lost political power, cultural influence, or simply the privilege of remembrance. Imagine a scribe in an ancient temple library, nothing dramatic, just a man sitting in a long, cool hall, listening to the scratch of his own reed pen. He consults an older papyrus, frowns, and quietly decides not to copy a certain name. Perhaps he was instructed, perhaps he was afraid, or perhaps the dynasty he ignored had been swallowed by a period of fragmentation when Egypt was ruled not by one throne, but by many small centers of power. Sometimes the erasure was not emotional, it was bureaucratic. Kings who held only local authority were not considered worthy of inclusion in national lists. That brings us to a crucial and often overlooked detail. Egyptian dynasties were not always unified across the land. For long stretches of time, especially during certain intermediate periods, rulers in the north and south held authority separately and even simultaneously. The notion of one continuous line of kings ruling all of Egypt is a comforting idea, but it was not the lived reality for many generations. Instead, local rulers, sometimes called nomarchs, stepped into power when the central government weakened. Their reigns were real, shaping economic decisions, irrigation schedules, temple staffing, and the distribution of grain during low Nile years. Yet they rarely appear in the grand official lists. They governed real people, but left almost no mark on the surviving narrative of kingship. This is where the dull but crucial details of archaeology become important. Many forgotten dynasties were rediscovered, not through dramatic tomb openings, but through the careful examination of storage pits, broken pottery with ink-written names, or administrative fragments buried beneath temple floors. A single chipped seal impression with a faint cartouche might represent the only surviving evidence of an entire ruler. Scholars sometimes spend years trying to identify whether two fragments refer to the same person, or if one king was actually two individuals confused in later retellings. These puzzles reveal something about the fragility of memory in ancient societies. Stone lasts a long time, but even stone cannot guarantee remembrance if no one bothers to preserve the story attached to it. Some lost dynasties disappeared because they ruled during times of famine or political collapse when record-keeping declined. Others vanished because later rulers had political motives to portray the past as more stable and unified than it actually was. There is something distinctly human about this. Even modern societies sometimes compress complicated periods into cleaner narratives, but the Egyptians mastered this art, presenting a polished sequence of rulers that hides long stretches of confusion, competing claimants, and regional dynasties whose influence might have been significant in their own time, but were inconvenient for later historians to acknowledge. Take, for example, the mysterious rulers who appear in the Turin royal canon, a fragile papyrus that lists dozens of kings otherwise unknown. Some ruled for what seems like a single year or even a few months during a chaotic stretch that historians now believe might represent rapid collapses, competing families, or multiple ephemeral regimes. The papyrus itself is damaged, broken into many fragments, and scholars have spent decades rearranging the pieces like a slow historical puzzle. Even as they reconstruct it, gaps remain, and those gaps are a reminder that entire dynasties once lived, governed, and passed into obscurity so thoroughly that only their names remain, sometimes incomplete or barely legible. It is also worth considering the human experience of living through such periods. Imagine an ordinary Egyptian farmer during a time when central authority faltered. He might have heard rumors of a new king in the north, or a local ruler claiming divine favor in the south. He might have seen tax collectors change uniforms or temple officials adjust their prayers to a slightly different royal name. These shifts mattered, but not in a dramatic, cinematic way. They were quiet adjustments, reflected in how much grain was required for temple offerings, or whether a canal was maintained properly. The daily life of ordinary Egyptians did not depend heavily on the identity of the pharaoh during stable times, but during fragmented periods, the reliability of authority could shape survival. What makes the lost dynasties so compelling is not just the absence of names, but the reminder that history is shaped as much by what is forgotten as by what is preserved. When we look at a neat king list carved into limestone, the emptiness between certain names tells its own story. A story of disruption, political maneuvering, or simply the slow erosion of memory. These absences become signposts pointing toward times of instability that do not always reveal themselves through dramatic ruins or grand monuments. Instead, they linger in the administrative silence between one ruler's record and the next. As you drift deeper into this story, consider how history often hides its most important truths in the gaps, in the quiet intervals where nothing appears to be happening, yet entire worlds are shifting. What might we find if we could step into those lost years and witness the rulers whose names were erased or never written at all? The story of ancient Egypt's lost dynasties becomes even more interesting when we step into the long, slow quiet of what historians call the First Intermediate Period. That name alone sounds dramatic, but in truth it was less a single event and more a drawn-out stretch of uncertainty, filled with administrative muddles, shifting local authority, and the gradual unraveling of the strong, centralized rule that had defined the Old Kingdom. It is during this period that we encounter some of the most obscure rulers in Egyptian history. Kings whose names appear only once, written in hurried ink on a pottery shard, or etched faintly in a tomb that was never completed. And while these details may seem uneventful on the surface, they shaped the long arc of Egypt's political evolution. What makes the First Intermediate Period so compelling is that it was not a time of total collapse. The Nile still rose each year, though some scholars argue that its floods were irregular. People still farmed, still baked bread, still carved limestone, and still wrote down their records. But the steadiness of central authority began to fade, leaving behind a mosaic of small power centers that would eventually give rise to forgotten dynasties. When the Old Kingdom ended, it was not with a dramatic fall. Instead, it reached a point where the machinery of state became too heavy to maintain. Officials passed their offices to their sons, local governors, nomarchs, grew powerful, and the lofty pyramid-building kingship of earlier centuries simply dissolved into smaller and more practical regional governments. One of the most important places during this time was the city of Heracleopolis. Located in the middle of the country, it became the seat of a line of rulers now known as the 9th and 10th dynasties. But for all their importance, these rulers left behind surprisingly little. The Heracleopolitan kings claimed authority over Egypt, yet their actual influence may have stretched only through the northern and central regions. Even their royal names are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Some appear in the later Turin canon. Others survive only through references in later tombs. These rulers were not forgotten through malice or political rewriting, but because their period lacked the monumental architecture and abundant inscriptions of stronger eras. When a dynasty builds almost exclusively with mud brick rather than stone, the sands of time are not kind. Meanwhile, further south in Thebes, another group of rulers slowly emerged, forming what scholars call the 11th dynasty. At first, they were simply local governors with modest tombs cut into the cliffs. Their authority did not extend beyond their region. But as the Heracleopolitan kings struggled to maintain control, the Theban rulers began to assert themselves. Their early names, such as Intef the Elder, appear occasionally on funerary stelae, but even these inscriptions are brief and practical. They offer little in terms of grand narrative or political propaganda. They are, instead, quiet records of individuals who held religious and administrative roles, slowly transforming themselves into kings. These two regional powers, the Heracleopolitan rulers in the north and the Theban line in the south, existed at the same time, both claiming legitimacy. This overlap is one of the reasons the dynastic lists from this period are so tangled. Later Egyptian historians preferred a clean sequence of rulers, yet this era was anything but clean. Some kings ruled simultaneously. Some ruled only a handful of towns. Some may never have held the full ceremonial powers expected of a pharaoh. And so, when the scribes of later centuries carved their official king lists, they quietly trimmed away the complexity, leaving behind a smoother but less accurate chain of succession. But the survival of these forgotten dynasties does not depend solely on royal names. Much of what we understand comes from the daily record-keeping that continued throughout the country, even as power fractured. For instance, tomb autobiographies, inscriptions found on the walls of nobles' burial places often contain far more political information than royal inscriptions from the same era. A governor might mention sending grain to a neighboring region during a low Nile year, or record helping a nearby town rebuild after local conflict. These practical details hint at the vulnerabilities of the time, when the absence of a strong central government forced local leaders to take on broader responsibilities. One such example comes from the tomb of Anktifi, a powerful nomarch from Hierakonpolis. His autobiography, written in confident and somewhat boastful terms, describes how he fed the hungry, secured supplies, and protected his region from rivals. He also refers to a time of famine so severe that people in nearby areas had resorted to desperate measures. Whether his account is exaggerated or not, it shows that political fragmentation had real consequences for ordinary people. When irrigation canals fell into disrepair, it was local rulers, not distant kings, who had to decide whether a community survived the season. It is in these dull but weighty administrative details that we find the shadow of the lost dynasties. We learn which families rose to prominence, which towns commanded respect, and which temples continued their rituals despite uncertainty. And we discover that even as central government weakened, the daily rhythm of Egyptian life persisted. Farmers still sowed barley and emmer, craftsmen still carved small funerary figurines, priests still recited mourning hymns to the gods. The endurance of these practices highlights a powerful truth. Egypt survived not because of its kings, but because of its people's adherence to predictable routine. Still, within this steady routine, the political tension between the Heracleopolitan and Theban lines continued to grow. The Theban rulers began expanding northward, and over time they gained control of key cities. The names of the earlier Theban rulers, Intef I, Intef II, Intef III, are recorded, but again, only faintly. Their tombs in the Theban cliffs indicate increasing power, but the inscriptions remain modest. They did not commission large monuments, perhaps because their authority was not yet secure enough to justify such displays. Their focus remained on stabilizing their region, forming alliances with local lords, and asserting control over the valuable agricultural land in the Nile Valley. Eventually, one Theban ruler, Mentuhotep II, succeeded in defeating the northern dynasty and reuniting Egypt. His reign marks the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, which historians regard as a time of renewed stability, administrative reform, and artistic development. But this success also contributed to the erasure of the Heracleopolitan line. The dynasty that lost the struggle was not remembered kindly. Their names, which had never been fully recorded to begin with, were not preserved by later generations. Their monuments, mostly built of fragile materials, crumbled. Their attempts to hold the kingdom together were overshadowed by the narrative of Theban triumph. This raises an important question about historical memory. How many other rulers, perhaps never mentioned in any surviving list, shaped the politics of their time without leaving a clear trace? For every king whose name survives in stone, there may have been several whose reigns were too brief, too contested, or too poorly recorded to endure. And it is not just kings. High priests, tax officials, military commanders, and provincial governors all played roles in maintaining stability. Their decisions affected harvests, trade routes, temple finances, and the movement of people. Without their work, the Middle Kingdom Renaissance might never have occurred. Archaeologists continue to discover new fragments from this period. A recently unearthed seal impression bearing the faint outline of a cartouche might belong to a previously unknown ruler. A damaged limestone stela might reveal a year of a king who appears nowhere else. These finds remind us that the historical record is incomplete and that the past remains open to revision. They also emphasize the fragile nature of memory. Something as simple as the quality of stone used for inscriptions can determine whose name survives and whose disappears. One of the most interesting aspects of this period is how ordinary Egyptians viewed authority when competing dynasties existed simultaneously. Evidence suggests that many people continued their rituals and economic activities without much concern for which ruler claimed the throne. As long as local officials maintained order and the temples continued their offerings, daily life felt stable enough. This sense of continuity allowed Egypt to endure political fragmentation without losing its cultural identity. Yet the gaps remain. When we look at the sequence of kings, the first intermediate period appears broken, uneven, and full of uncertainty. But those very gaps reveal the flexibility and resilience of Egyptian society. They show how communities adapted when central authority weakened, how local rulers stepped into roles once held by pharaohs, and how individuals navigated shifting loyalties. The lost dynasties of this era are not merely missing names. They represent an entire way of life that persisted despite political fragmentation. As we leave this period behind and move toward later eras, where lost dynasties become even harder to trace, one quiet question lingers. How much of any civilization is shaped not by the rulers whose names endure, but by those who ruled briefly, quietly, or without the expectation that history would remember them at all? When we step from the first intermediate period into the long shadows of the second intermediate period, the quiet complexity of Egypt's forgotten dynasties becomes even more layered. This era, stretching through centuries when the central throne fractured once again, presents an even more tangled historical landscape. It is here that we encounter rulers who left behind scarcely more than a name, and sometimes not even that, just a symbol on a scarab or a title on a crumbling fragment of papyrus. And it is here that the fabric of Egyptian society adapts, slows, and stretches under pressures both internal and foreign. Unlike the earlier period, the second intermediate period is shaped by multiple cultural and political forces intersecting across Egypt. In the north, foreign rulers known as the Hyksos established their seat at Avaris, bringing with them unfamiliar traditions, technologies, and administrative habits. In the south, native Egyptian dynasties continued to rule from Thebes, clinging to older traditions while also responding to the profound shifts happening around them. And in between these poles of power, smaller, short-lived dynasties flickered in and out of existence, leaving behind only the faintest traces in the archaeological record. One of the most difficult challenges historians face in this period is the sequence of the so-called 13th dynasty. In later king lists, the names of its rulers are jumbled, incomplete, or missing entirely. Scholars generally agree that this dynasty contained many kings, possibly dozens, some ruling for only a few months. Their authority was fragile, their resources stretched thin, and their ability to command loyalty varied from region to region. A king who issued decrees in the Fayum might be unknown in Upper Egypt. Another who built a modest chapel in one town might never have established influence beyond a few neighboring settlements. Their reigns were real, valuable to the people who lived under them, yet nearly invisible in the surviving record. The evidence we do have often comes from objects that were not meant to last long: small scarab seals, hastily carved stelae, or administrative notes written on papyrus that miraculously survived the centuries. These mundane objects, designed for immediate use rather than eternal remembrance, have become the primary clues for reconstructing the forgotten lines of kings. A single scarab bearing the name of a ruler like Kenja might help historians place him in relation to a few other kings, but many details when he ruled, how long, and what influence he had remain uncertain. This uncertainty defines the entire era. Meanwhile, in Thebes, the rulers of the 17th dynasty began to consolidate local power. Their story is better remembered today because their line eventually rose up against the Hyksos, paving the way for Egypt's reunification. But before they became symbols of national revival, they were simply regional leaders, managing local temples, overseeing irrigation, and attempting to preserve the cultural traditions that gave their city its identity. Their early rulers bore names like Sobekemsaf and Intef, names that appear occasionally on wooden coffins or modest monuments. Yet these records emphasize the practical duties of kingship rather than grand narratives. They mention offerings, temple repairs, and the maintenance of funerary cults, reminders that ruling was as much administrative labor as it was symbolic authority. The influence of the Hyksos in the north adds another layer to this period's complexity. Contrary to older misconceptions, the Hyksos were not simply invaders who swept into Egypt in a sudden wave. Their rise was gradual, shaped by decades of immigration, trade, and cultural blending in the delta. The people we call Hyksos were of mixed origins, bringing Near Eastern practices such as new types of weaponry, different pottery styles, and possibly even the horse and chariot. Their rulers adopted Egyptian titles and embraced some native traditions, yet they maintained their own distinctive elements. They built palaces at Avaris, managed long-distance trade routes, and integrated themselves into the economic networks of Egypt. What makes the Hyksos rulers part of the story of forgotten dynasties is not that they were erased. Indeed, they are better documented than some native dynasties, but that the complexity of their influence is often reduced in hindsight. They oversaw a thriving multicultural society where Egyptians, Canaanites, and other groups lived side by side. Their administrators issued seals inscribed with Egyptian hieroglyphs, yet their artistic style bore unmistakable foreign influences. For ordinary Egyptians living in the Delta, these rulers were simply the people who maintained the canals, managed the tax system, and provided security along trade routes. Life under their reign was not dramatically different from life under previous rulers, despite the cultural tension that would emerge later. Between the Hyksos in the north and the Thebans in the south, another small but significant dynasty emerged, one that scholars call the 14th dynasty. This group likely ruled local areas in the western delta, and their reigns overlapped with those of the 13th dynasty. Their existence is pieced together from fragmentary sources, and many of their names are known only from the damaged Turin canon. These rulers exemplify the fragile nature of historical memory. Kings who governed real communities, maintained real towns, and oversaw real agricultural systems, yet who left behind almost no physical legacy. What is often overlooked in telling the story of this era is the resilience of the Egyptian people themselves. Even when multiple dynasties ruled simultaneously, many aspects of daily life continued uninterrupted. Farmers still planted barley and flax in the fertile fields. Fishermen cast their nets into the river. Artisans carved wooden coffins, crafted pottery, and painted scenes of daily life in tombs. Priests in local temples continued to recite hymns, tending to the statues of gods whose worship stretched back centuries. The slow, rhythmic flow of Egyptian life persisted, even when political authority shifted. Yet beneath this surface continuity, people undoubtedly adapted to the changing landscape. When authority became fragmented, local officials took on greater responsibility. A town could no longer rely on a distant pharaoh to resolve disputes or provide resources, so communities turned inward. Families developed localized survival strategies, storing grain more carefully, forming alliances with nearby settlements, or adapting their irrigation methods to compensate for inconsistent oversight. These subtle adaptations rarely appear in inscriptions, yet they shaped the lived experience of the Second Intermediate Period. The fragmented political landscape also influenced burial practices. Some regions experienced a decline in elaborate tomb construction, replaced by simpler burials that required fewer resources. Coffins became more standardized, and inscriptions more formulaic. These changes reflect practical constraints rather than cultural decline. In uncertain times, people prioritized essential needs, choosing affordable ways to maintain religious traditions without the elaborate architecture of earlier eras. Even in their simplicity, these burials preserve invaluable information about the people who lived through the era of lost dynasties, their names, family structures, occupations, and religious beliefs. The period also saw an increase in local artistic experimentation. In some areas, foreign motifs blended with Egyptian styles, creating unique hybrid forms. Scarab seals, a common administrative tool, display a wide variety of shapes and decorative patterns during this time. Pottery styles shifted, incorporating influences from neighboring regions. These subtle changes reveal the cultural diversity that flourished when centralized control loosened, while later periods preferred orderly, unified artistic styles. The Second Intermediate Period embraced variety, another reason why its dynasties remain difficult to categorize. As tensions between the Thebans and the Hyksos increased, the political landscape began to shift. The Theban rulers launched campaigns to reclaim territory, and eventually, under Seqenenretau and his successors, conflict escalated. The later struggles would eventually lead to the expulsion of the Hyksos and the rise of the 18th dynasty, ushering in the New Kingdom, an era famous for its powerful rulers and monumental architecture. Yet before this dramatic turn, for many decades, Egyptians lived with the reality of multiple overlapping dynasties, each leaving behind its own faint imprint. The Second Intermediate Period reminds us that history is often shaped not by clean lines of succession, but by overlapping, ambiguous periods where authority blurs and identities shift. For every well-known king like Kamosi or Ahmose, there are dozens whose names survive only in fragments or whose identities remain unclear. And for every fragment we uncover, there are likely countless others lost forever. As we leave this period behind and continue deeper into the story of Egypt's lost dynasties, a quiet question lingers. How many rulers shaped Egypt's path in ways we can no longer see, and how many more still wait beneath the sand, their traces scattered in objects so ordinary that they were never meant to endure at all? As we move deeper into the story of ancient Egypt's forgotten dynasties, the landscape of Upper Egypt becomes the quiet stage on which some of the most obscure rulers in Egyptian history played their roles. This region, stretching from the arid cliffs of Abydos to the temple-lined banks of Thebes, is where small, local dynasties emerged during times of fragmented authority. Many of these rulers were not kings in the traditional sense. Some were powerful nomarchs elevated by circumstance. Others were priests whose administrative duties expanded in the absence of central control. A few may have claimed royal titles only after the fact, when their families tried to preserve memory in inscriptions long after their brief influence had passed. The story of these Upper Egyptian dynasties is subtle. It unfolds not through grand monuments or sweeping military campaigns, but through small administrative choices, modest architectural projects, and the stubborn continuity of local traditions. It requires careful reading of faint inscriptions on cliff tombs, analysis of pottery assemblages, and study of the quiet bureaucratic language carved on stelae. Every clue matters, because these regions far from the monumental capitals preserved a very different perspective on kingship. One of the most important aspects of Upper Egypt during fragmented periods is the resilience of local religious institutions. Temples remained some of the most stable sources of authority, not because they held political ambition, but because they maintained ritual calendars and controlled land, labor, and agricultural storage. When central governments weakened, temples inevitably filled the gap. This is why many of the minor rulers from Upper Egypt appear primarily in religious contexts. Their names survive on objects associated with offerings, donations, or maintenance of temple property. Consider Abydos, a city that held deep religious significance long before dynastic Egypt fully formed. During periods of political weakness, Abydos often retained its status as a spiritual center, even when its political influence declined. Rulers in the surrounding region frequently sought legitimacy through their connection to this sacred site. Some left small stelae invoking Osiris, hoping that even if worldly recognition failed, divine acknowledgement might endure. These small inscriptions often list the titles of local leaders, overseers of priests, chiefs of towns, keepers of granaries, revealing the blurred boundary between civil administration and religious authority. Further south, in places like Edfu and Hierakonpolis, archaeological excavations have uncovered traces of local rulers whose names never appeared in official king lists. These rulers commissioned modest tombs, sometimes built partially into the cliffs or carved directly into the rock. Their inscriptions detail offerings of bread, beer, and incense, emphasizing their role in maintaining order and supporting religious practice. These records contain no boasting of conquest or grand construction. Instead, they highlight the two most important responsibilities of leadership in uncertain times: keeping the food supply stable and ensuring that rituals continued unbroken. The local ruling families of Upper Egypt often relied on personal relationships rather than formal titles. A governor might inherit his position from a father who had been both a scribe and a temple administrator. Marriage alliances between families strengthened ties across towns. These connections created networks of obligation that helped maintain stability even when distant pharaohs were unable to impose order. While these details might seem mundane, they were among the most critical forces shaping life in Upper Egypt. Survival depended on predictability, and predictability was sustained by people who managed irrigation, storage, and taxation with quiet determination. Archaeological evidence from the Second Intermediate Period and surrounding eras reveals interesting patterns in burial practices across Upper Egypt. Tombs of local rulers frequently contain wooden coffins painted with scenes of everyday life offerings, ploughing fields, fishing, weaving. These images, simple yet precise, serve not merely decorative purposes but acted as assurances of continuity. They reflected a worldview in which the afterlife depended on replicating the essential tasks of life. Within these scenes, small inscriptions sometimes mention the names of minor rulers or officials, providing rare glimpses into the structure of local authority. These burials often lack the grandeur associated with royal tombs. There are no massive stone sarcophagi or elaborate corridors lined with painted murals. Instead, archaeologists find modest constructions made of mud brick or carved into natural rock formations. The economy of these designs reflects the constraints of the time, yet they remain rich sources of information. For example, the placement of certain symbols, names of local gods, brief prayers, or formulaic offering statements reveals regional variations in belief. These localized traditions thrived precisely because they were not overshadowed by the dominance of a central monarchy. Among the most intriguing traces of Upper Egyptian dynasties are the administrative papyri found near sites such as Gebel. These documents, written in flowing hieratic script, detail everything from grain deliveries to labor assignments. One papyrus lists the names of workers allocated to maintain canals during a year of low Nile flood. Another records the distribution of barley seed to farmers in nearby villages. These records rarely mention kings. Instead, they name local overseers, scribes, and supervisors. This absence of royal authority is itself a clue. In periods when dynasties in Memphis or Avaris or Thebes held only tenuous power, the true managers of Egypt were the officials who kept these administrative tasks functioning. This focus on local administration helps explain why certain Upper Egyptian dynasties faded from history so easily. Their authority was rooted not in monumental building or military dominance, but in practical management. When central authority was restored and new rulers established strong, unified governments, the memory of these small dynasties was quietly absorbed into the broader narrative. Later scribes, seeking order and clarity, simplified the king lists, excluding rulers who did not fit their idea of legitimate pharaohs. As a result, entire families who had shaped the livelihoods of their regions became invisible in the official record. The cultural landscape of Upper Egypt further complicates the historical picture. This region maintained traditions that differed subtly from those in the north. Artistic motifs, linguistic forms, and even religious emphases varied from town to town. These differences mattered deeply to the people of the time, but appear only faintly in the archaeological record. A particular style of pottery decoration, unique to a small settlement, might indicate the influence of a local dynasty. A set of administrative seals bearing an unfamiliar name might hint at a short-lived line of rulers. Such clues are painstakingly pieced together by historians attempting to reconstruct the political patchwork of the era. One of the central challenges of studying these forgotten dynasties is that Upper Egypt's archaeological record depends heavily on preservation conditions. Mud brick structures degrade quickly, papyrus decays unless preserved under dry, stable conditions. Even tomb inscriptions can erode if exposed to shifting sand or water. What survives is often a matter of chance. A tomb, protected by a fallen boulder, might preserve the name of a ruler otherwise unknown. A cache of papyri sealed in a forgotten storeroom might reveal administrative practices previously undocumented. The survival of history often hangs by the thinnest of threads. Yet despite these gaps, a consistent theme emerges from the surviving evidence. The people of Upper Egypt valued steady management above displays of power. Their rulers, whether they claimed royal titles or not, were tasked with maintaining a functional society. They oversaw the distribution of grain, managed the repair of irrigation canals, ensured the completion of temple rituals, and coordinated labor for construction projects. These tasks required patience, organization, and continuity. And though these qualities rarely impressed later historians, they shaped the daily lives of thousands. When we consider the forgotten dynasties of Upper Egypt, we are reminded that political power does not always leave a monumental trace. Some rulers influence history through administration rather than architecture, through community ties rather than conquest. Their legacy survives not in grand narratives, but in the steady rhythm of life they preserved. As we prepare to move into the next part of the story, where the political landscape shifts once again and the rewriting of history becomes more deliberate, a final question lingers softly, like an unfinished inscription on a broken stela. How many more rulers flickered briefly across Egypt's vast landscape, guiding their communities through uncertainty, only to fade from memory because their achievements were too practical, too modest, or too ordinary to be carved into stone? Before we move further into the long corridors of Egypt's forgotten rulers, let me gently remind you, if you have not subscribed yet, please consider doing so. These lost dynasties vanished partly because no one kept their records alive. We, too, risk fading into the digital equivalent of a collapsed mud brick granary without your support. So please subscribe, not only to save us from historical oblivion, but to ensure that stories like this stay alive and resurfaced from the sands. As the Middle Kingdom reasserted control over a fractured land, Egypt began another cycle of political consolidation. With that consolidation came something subtle but decisive: the reshaping of history. When later kings wanted to show themselves as the restorers of order, they naturally preferred a clean story. They sought to portray the centuries before them as chaotic interludes, filled with weak rulers, minor kings, or illegitimate dynasties best forgotten. This selective remembering was not malicious in the modern sense. It was a cultural practice rooted in the belief that the pharaoh embodied divine order, and anything that did not align with that ideal did not belong in the official memory of the nation. The 12th dynasty, emerging in the early years of what we call the Middle Kingdom, became one of the primary architects of this narrative. Kings like Amenemhat I and Senusret I wished to establish themselves as restorers of harmony after generations of regional fragmentation. Their scribes wrote hymns praising the re-establishment of unity, often glossing over the existence of numerous small, local dynasties that had flourished during the first intermediate period. These families might have ruled effectively in their provinces, but their power did not fit the new vision of centralized authority. As a result, they were omitted from king lists and temple walls. Even more striking is the way later kings physically altered monuments from earlier times. In some cases, cartouches were chiseled out, leaving empty oval depressions like missing pieces in an enormous historical puzzle. Sometimes names were replaced entirely, so that a temple relief originally dedicated to one ruler was recarved to honor another. These modifications were not always acts of hostility. Often they were practical. Stone was precious, and reusing existing materials was efficient. Yet the effect remains the same: gaps, mismatches, and odd inconsistencies that modern scholars must navigate carefully. Historical rewriting did not only occur on stone. It happened in papyri too, fragile documents often more revealing than their monumental counterparts. A scribal exercise from the early Middle Kingdom, found in fragments, refers to a sequence of kings in a way that subtly contradicts the official lists. It includes names that appear nowhere else, scribbled almost casually as examples of writing practice. Were these hints of actual rulers, or simply fictional names invented for writing exercises? The ambiguity is typical of this era. The truth lies somewhere between the ink strokes, and modern historians spend years debating what counts as evidence and what counts as scribal habit. One of the most significant tools of historical revision was literature. The Middle Kingdom produced a flourishing body of writing instructional texts, royal propaganda, tales of political instability, and reflections on what constitutes rightful rule. Works like The Prophecy of Neferti describe a land plunged into disorder before being restored by a righteous king. While these stories are layered with symbolism, they reflect a worldview in which past political fragmentation served as a cautionary backdrop for celebrating current stability. The message was clear: Egypt thrives under strong central authority, and whatever happened during the intervening dynasties was best understood as a dark period rather than a legitimate era of rule. Archaeological evidence, however, reveals a more complex picture. The First Intermediate Period, for instance, was not an age of unbroken chaos. Many regions prospered under their local dynasties. Administrative documents from places like Heracleopolis and Thebes show functioning courts, active temple life, and economic stability. Local governors invested in irrigation and grain storage. People married, buried their dead, and recorded the transfers of land and property. These small, bureaucratic details, the number of grain sacks allocated to a worker's family, the listing of responsibilities for temple staff, present a quieter, more stable view of life than the literary portrayals suggest. In the reconstruction of Egyptian history, pottery again plays a vital role. During periods of shifting power, ceramic styles changed subtly the thickness of a rim, the depth of a bowl, or the particular form of a storage jar. These seemingly dull variations help archaeologists identify which regions were thriving independently and which were influenced by a central authority. In some cemeteries, pottery forms appear that match no known centralized style, suggesting the presence of small, independent dynasties with their own cultural preferences. Burial practices also reflect how locals navigated the political landscape. In parts of Upper Egypt, tombs from this era show unique artistic motifs and different uses of hieroglyphic space. Names of local rulers appear occasionally, often with titles resembling royal ones, but without reference to broader national authority. These traces show that people living under these rulers viewed them as legitimate, even if later generations chose to ignore their existence. One of the most intriguing examples comes from the necropolis at Deir el-Bersha. Tombs belonging to local governors contain inscriptions with long genealogical records spanning several generations. Some of these genealogies reference rulers who are unknown elsewhere. They may have been small-scale kings whose influence never extended beyond a limited region, but they were significant enough for local officials to record their names. These lists, carved without any intention of influencing national history, now provide glimpses of dynasties that would otherwise be entirely lost. Over time, as the Middle Kingdom strengthened its grip on the land, these local traditions began to fade. Administrative practices were standardized, temple rituals unified, and the royal narrative became dominant. Lists carved in monumental sites presented a carefully curated lineage intended to reinforce the authority of the reigning pharaoh. These lists form the backbone of how ancient Egyptian history has long been taught, yet they omit so many names and periods that they often tell only a fraction of the full story. What is most fascinating is that many of the omissions were not due to conspiracies or efforts at deception, but simply because the scope of authority had changed. From the perspective of the Middle Kingdom scribes, regional dynasties were not part of the rightful flow of Egyptian leadership. Their exclusion was a reflection of worldview rather than malice. Egypt was imagined as a unified kingdom under one god-king, and anything that did not align with that ideal was filtered out. Still, despite the power of this narrative, archaeology quietly tells a different story, one of multiple centers of authority, overlapping claims to legitimacy, and the persistence of regional identity. Even when the official memory suppressed these smaller dynasties, the land itself preserved their traces. Mud brick walls, broken vessels, faded inscriptions, and the occasional mention in an otherwise mundane, administrative papyrus all speak to a time when Egypt was far more diverse politically than later history allowed. This tension between official memory and archaeological reality raises a profound question about the nature of history itself. When a civilization chooses which stories to preserve and which to forget, how much of the past disappears in the process? And how many more forgotten rulers still wait in the quiet sand, their names unrecorded, their lives unremembered, yet their influence lingering in ways we have yet to understand? By the time the modern world began peeling back the layers of Egypt's forgotten rulers, the landscape had already changed so many times that rediscovery required not only archaeological skill, but patience for the slow, methodical work that rarely makes headlines. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw an enormous surge in interest in Egyptian antiquity. Yet this fascination, romantic as it seemed, often collided with the reality that most clues to the lost dynasties were not found in golden tombs or sweeping temples, but in broken pottery, faint inscriptions, and mislabeled drawers tucked away in museum basements. Many early excavations operated under different assumptions than those used today. Archaeologists in the 1880s or the 19-teens focused primarily on monuments, royal tombs, and objects they viewed as artistically impressive. But Egypt's lost dynasties, by their very nature, did not leave behind grand monuments. Their remains were humbler, a chipped stela from a local shrine, a few mud brick walls, or a fragment of papyrus preserved only because the dry desert air happened to blow sand over it at the right moment. These small traces, overlooked by early excavators, would later become essential pieces of evidence. Some of the most important discoveries came not from desert trenches but from museum storerooms. In the British Museum, for example, a faded fragment of papyrus, rediscovered in the early 1920s, listed a sequence of rulers inconsistent with the known king lists. For decades, it had been filed under miscellaneous fragments, its significance unnoticed. When scholars compared it to similar documents in Turin and Leiden, they found references to rulers whose reigns may have lasted only a handful of years, rulers who bridged gaps between established dynasties. These were not the great conquerors or temple builders who dominate popular history, but rather the forgotten administrators who stabilized towns, directed food distribution, or negotiated with local elites during unsettled times. The archaeology of the early 20th century was far from perfect. Field notes were sometimes sparse, measurements inconsistent, and objects dispersed among institutions without complete records. Yet these efforts laid the groundwork for future scholars who later returned to old excavation reports and recognized patterns that their predecessors had not noticed. A pottery shard found in a dig from 1911 might be connected to an inscription excavated 2 decades later. A mislabeled coffin panel from the 1890s might be reinterpreted with new linguistic knowledge. The history of uncovering Egypt's lost dynasties became a slow, multi-generational puzzle requiring constant re-evaluation. The development of more rigorous archaeological methods in the later 20th century transformed our understanding even further. Stratigraphy, once treated casually in early digs, became essential. Careful recording of soil layers revealed sequences of occupation at sites that had once been considered unimportant. At the site of Hierakonpolis, for example, archaeologists working in the 1970s noticed subtle differences in pottery styles and burial layouts that suggested multiple phases of local rule. These phases did not correspond neatly to the official chronology, but pointed toward periods of semi-independent governance. Radiocarbon dating, though not perfect, added another layer of evidence. Samples from wooden coffins, reed baskets, or linen wrappings began to reveal timelines that sometimes contradicted the traditional king lists compiled by earlier Egyptologists. These discrepancies were not errors, but windows into missing periods intervals where local rulers might have governed without leaving durable inscriptions. Radiocarbon results prompted scholars to reconsider the length of certain dynasties, the overlap between rival rulers, and the existence of transitional phases that had previously been compressed or omitted in historical narratives. Another important development was the re-evaluation of objects long considered unimportant. Items once thought of as household debris, broken bowls, flint tools, simple beads began to be studied as cultural markers. The shape of a bowl or the decorative pattern on a bead could indicate trade connections, technological skills, or shifts in cultural influence. In some cases, pottery styles found in one region matched those found hundreds of miles away, implying alliances or shared identity between local dynasties. These links rarely appear in official inscriptions but speak volumes about the social landscape of ancient Egypt. Archaeologists also began paying closer attention to settlement sites, which earlier excavators often ignored in favor of monumental temples and tombs. Settlements hold invaluable evidence of daily life. Storage rooms filled with grain husks, hearths preserved in ash, workshops with unfinished tools, or administrative buildings littered with seal impressions. At Tel el-Dabba, for example, excavations revealed layers of occupation reflecting both local Egyptian rulers and later foreign influence. Each layer contained clues about shifting power dynamics, changes in architecture, diet, or trade goods. These small details helped clarify the broader picture of who governed the region during times when official documentation was sparse. In addition to field discoveries, the 20th century saw significant progress in deciphering texts. Advances in understanding the variations of hieratic script, the cursive form used for everyday writing, allowed scholars to properly read documents that had languished untranslated for decades. Administrative notes, grain receipts, tax registers, and letters between officials suddenly revealed glimpses of rulers whose names never appeared on temple walls. Even something as simple as a delivery note for cattle or a record of temple offerings could mention a local king or a transitional ruler. Equally important were the attempts to restore damaged papyri. Techniques involving infrared photography, fiber analysis, and careful reconstruction of layers allowed scholars to recover text that had faded nearly to invisibility. In one notable case, a papyrus in Turin contained a king list with several missing sections. Modern technology helped reveal faint traces of names previously unreadable. Some of these names matched those found on obscure inscriptions in provincial tombs, suggesting the existence of short-lived dynasties between more established periods. Museums across Europe and the Middle East began collaborating, comparing fragments once thought unrelated. This cross-institutional work yielded unexpected connections. A sandstone block in Berlin, a loose ostracon in Cairo, and a stellar fragment in Brussels turned out to refer to the same ruler, a minor king who governed during the late Second Intermediate period. His name, nearly lost to history, emerged only because modern scholars were patient enough to trace its appearance across 3 continents. The restoration of old excavation records proved equally valuable. In the 20th century, researchers revisited notebooks from excavations conducted in the 1880s and 1920s. Some of these notes included hand-drawn sketches of inscriptions that had since deteriorated or disappeared entirely. Though imprecise by modern standards, these drawings preserved information that no longer existed in the physical world. In several cases, sketches documented titles used by minor rulers whose monuments had later been damaged or repurposed, providing rare evidence of their authority. The work was not glamorous. It required long hours in archives, careful comparison of handwriting, and the ability to decipher abbreviations used by excavators who never imagined their notes would serve as primary sources for future generations. Yet without these dull, meticulous tasks, many clues to the lost dynasties would remain invisible. As the century progressed, scholars developed more refined chronologies, though these remained contested. Debates emerged about the exact length of reigns, the nature of co-regencies, and the overlapping claims of regional rulers. Some argued for longer chronologies, suggesting certain dynasties lasted decades longer than traditionally believed. Others proposed shorter chronologies, compressing reigns and emphasizing the instability of certain periods. While these debates may appear technical, even tedious, they are critical for understanding how power shifted across the centuries. Each reinterpretation reshaped the map of Egypt's political landscape. Sites previously dismissed as insignificant gained new importance. A small temple in the Fayum Basin, for instance, contained inscriptions referencing local leaders who likely governed independently during the breakdown of central authority. The temple had been known since the 19th century, but its inscriptions were considered unremarkable. With new linguistic analysis, they were recognized as evidence of a local dynasty operating during one of the least documented periods of Egyptian history. The study of environmental data also expanded. Pollen samples, sediment layers, and botanical remains indicated fluctuations in climate and agricultural conditions. These shifts influenced the rise and fall of local rulers. A period of reduced Nile flooding could weaken central authority, allowing regional leaders to gain influence. Conversely, years of plentiful harvests often accompanied political unification. These environmental clues, though mundane, help historians understand why certain dynasties emerged and why others disappeared. Through all of this, a pattern becomes clear. The recovery of lost dynasties relies on fragments, on small details overlooked or undervalued in earlier centuries. It is not a story of dramatic revelations, but of slow accumulation, the gradual layering of evidence from pottery shards, faded ink, and careful comparison of scattered clues. The history that emerges is not smooth or complete. It is patchy, uneven, full of uncertainties, yet more accurate because of these imperfections. And so we are left with a lingering question. If so much has been rediscovered through fragments once dismissed as insignificant, how many more forgotten rulers remain hidden in boxes, beneath sands, or within layers of text that we have not yet learned how to read? For most people, Egypt's history feels like one long, unbroken story. Pyramids, mummies, golden masks, and perhaps a Cleopatra cameo if Hollywood is involved. But Egypt was never a single, uninterrupted empire. It fractured, healed, fractured again, and occasionally fell under the rule of powerful neighbors. And one of the most fascinating episodes, mysterious, under-discussed, nearly forgotten, was the era when the pharaohs of Egypt were not Egyptian at all. They were Kushite, Nubians from the kingdom of Kush, rulers from the south, who swept into Egypt during one of its weakest moments, united the two lands, revived old traditions, restored temples older than their own ancestors' memories, and then lost everything just as quickly as they had gained it. This was the 25th dynasty, the so-called Black Pharaohs, a dynasty erased, minimized, or overshadowed for centuries, but one that left an indelible mark on Egyptian history. Let's step into the world they reshaped. Egypt before the Kushites. A kingdom in shambles. When the Kushites looked north, Egypt was a disaster zone. After centuries of invasions, rebellions, and bickering warlords, the once mighty Egyptian crown had shrunk to a fragile regional power. Lower Egypt was split among squabbling delta princes. Upper Egypt was controlled by petty rulers who barely had enough land to graze goats. The priesthood at Thebes clung to wealth but had lost influence. Everyone wanted to be pharaoh. Nobody could be pharaoh. It was the kind of internal collapse that practically invited a stronger kingdom to step in. Kush had been watching this slow motion unraveling for generations, and Kush was ready. The Kushites not invaders, but cultural heirs. One thing modern readers often misunderstand is that Kush and Egypt were not strangers. They shared thousands of years of cultural exchange. They fought, traded, intermarried, and influenced one another endlessly. Kush adopted Egyptian gods, writing systems, art styles, and architecture, sometimes preserving traditions that Egypt itself had abandoned. By the time the 25th dynasty rose, Kush saw itself not as a foreign enemy overtaking Egypt, but as a rightful guardian restoring a fallen civilization. And honestly, they kind of did. Pa the Conqueror, who didn't want to kill anyone. Everything changed under Pa, the Kushite king, who marched north into Egypt around 728 BCE. But unlike most conquerors, Pa was, well, oddly polite about it. He didn't burn cities. He didn't wipe out dynasties. He didn't massacre civilians. Instead, he scolded Egyptian princes like a disappointed father, telling teenagers to stop fighting over the family car. His invasion was more like a divine intervention, complete with proclamations, oaths, and dramatic temple rituals. When cities surrendered, he wrote about it with almost smug satisfaction. His victory stela is basically the world's earliest "I told you so." When he finally united Egypt, Pa didn't even stay. He returned to Nubia, declared the land purified and restored, and resumed life at his capital Napata. His successors, though, would stay and rule both kingdoms as a single, sacred empire. Shabaka the Rebuilder. After Pa came Shabaka, who took the title Pharaoh of Egypt and set out to do something bold, revive old kingdom traditions that had been dead for over 1,000 years. He repaired temples across Egypt. He restored ancient rituals. He brought back classical art styles. He even recopied crumbling sacred texts that had nearly vanished from history. To many Egyptians, he looked less like a foreign ruler and more like a reincarnation of the ancient kings, someone who cared about Egypt's spiritual soul more than Egypt's last few dynasties had. Shabaka was a builder and restorer, but the world around him was changing. A new empire was rising to the northeast, Assyria, and the Kushites, despite their cultural might, were about to meet a superpower that did not care about temples, traditions, or the gods of Egypt. Taharqa, the warrior pharaoh who fought the world. If history was fair, Taharqa would be one of the most famous pharaohs in the world. He was everything Egypt liked in a king: charismatic, visionary, devout, physically towering, militarily capable, and unstoppable. Until he wasn't. Under his reign, Egypt entered a golden revival. Temples rebuilt, prosperity restored, art flourishing again. But Taharqa's real legacy was his rivalry with the Assyrian Empire. This was not a fair fight. Assyria had iron weapons, siege engines, professional armies, and a military-industrial complex that made every other kingdom sweat nervously. Egypt and Kush fought back with determination and bravery, but the Assyrians were relentless. Year after year, battle after battle, Egypt's cities burned under the pressure of a force too vast to stop. Taharqa fought like a lion, retreated strategically, came back twice as strong, and inspired legends among his people. But even great lions fall, the slow death of a dynasty. Assyrian armies stormed through the delta, shattered Egypt's fragile alliances, and forced Taharqa and later his successor, Tanutamani, to retreat south. Memphis fell, Thebes was sacked, Egypt fractured again, and with that, Kushite rule came to an end. Egypt didn't defeat the 25th dynasty. Assyria did. But the dynasty didn't disappear. It simply stepped back across the border and continued ruling Kush for nearly 1,000 more years. The pharaohs of the 25th dynasty built pyramids, real pyramids in Nubia, long after Egypt had stopped building them. They preserved ancient Egyptian religious rituals that even the later Ptolemies never fully understood. They carried the flame forward, a flame that would survive long past the fall of Egypt. Why the 25th dynasty was nearly forgotten. For a long time, European historians minimized or ignored the dynasty because it didn't fit their preferred narratives of ancient Egypt. Racial and colonial biases played a major role. Kushite contributions were downplayed, their achievements erased or dismissed. Only in the last century has archaeology restored their significance. Today, the 25th dynasty is recognized for what it was, one of the most culturally transformative eras in Egyptian history. A dynasty that didn't conquer to dominate, but conquered to restore. A dynasty that revived the spirit of Egypt when Egypt had forgotten itself. A dynasty that left behind pyramids, temples, battles, legends, and a legacy far too powerful to remain forgotten. The history of Egypt often presents itself as neatly ordered. Dynasties rise, kings reign, pyramids are built, temples flourish, and the story moves forward in a straight line. But if you lean closer to the delta, around the northeastern edges of the Nile, you encounter a different reality, one of shadows, uncertainty, and rulers whose names appear only faintly, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in scribbled lists that barely survived the centuries. This is the story of the 14th dynasty, a period so obscure that scholars still debate the existence, number, and sequence of its kings. It is a dynasty that has been, quite literally, lost to time. The Delta region, with its fertile fields and access to the Mediterranean, was both a prize and a vulnerability. Throughout the Second Intermediate Period, Egypt was fragmented, and political authority was contested between Thebes in the south and local rulers in the north. These rulers, often forgotten by later scribes, governed independently, built small fortifications, managed trade along the Nile, and maintained cults for local deities. Their reigns were often brief, their power limited, but their influence on everyday life was real. Yet centuries later, as Egypt's scribes attempted to compile king lists, many of these Delta kings were omitted entirely. In the grand narrative of pharaohs, they barely existed. Our understanding of the 14th dynasty comes primarily from two sources: fragmented king lists, such as the Turin Canon, and the archaeological record from the northern delta. The Turin Canon, a papyrus created during the reign of Ramses II in the 19th dynasty, attempts to list all rulers. Yet for this period, the entries are largely damaged or unreadable. Scholars have reconstructed portions, revealing names of rulers that cannot be found elsewhere. Some of these kings may have ruled simultaneously in small city-states, while others appear as successive rulers over a single province. The lack of monumental evidence means that historians must interpret what little survives with extraordinary caution. Archaeological discoveries in the Delta provide a glimpse into the life and administration of this shadow dynasty. Excavations at sites such as Avaris, the later capital of the Hyksos, and other northern settlements reveal fortifications, administrative buildings, and residential complexes dating to this period. Pottery styles and inscriptions suggest localized governance and continuity of trade networks, even as political authority was fractured. These rulers, though absent from temples in Thebes or Memphite archives, were active participants in the social and economic fabric of their regions. They taxed farmers, organized irrigation projects, and maintained local religious institutions. Daily life continued under their oversight, despite the lack of recognition from southern authorities or later historians. The 14th dynasty illustrates the fluidity of power in Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. Unlike the centralized pharaohs of the Old or Middle Kingdom, these northern rulers often held sway only within a few dozen miles along the Nile. Their control depended on local alliances, family connections, and occasionally military strength. The deltaic environment, marshes, canals, and distributary channels both protected and isolated them, creating pockets of semi-autonomous authority. It is in these conditions that small dynasties could emerge, thrive briefly, and vanish with little trace. One of the striking features of this period is the overlap between dynasties. While the 14th dynasty ruled in the Delta, the 13th dynasty in Upper Egypt maintained its own centralized authority from Memphis and Thebes. These dynasties were not always in open conflict. Sometimes they coexisted peacefully, trading goods and occasionally intermarrying to solidify alliances. At other times, however, tensions led to skirmishes and sieges. The evidence comes from damaged stelae and sporadic inscriptions, recording military campaigns, local uprisings, or the repair of fortifications after attacks. Even in the sparsity of evidence, one can trace a complex political landscape of shifting loyalties and contested authority. The kings of the 14th dynasty were often obscure figures. Some appear only as names without accompanying titles, while others are known from a single artifact, such as a scarab or seal impression. Scarabs, small amulets, often inscribed with royal names, provide crucial information about trade, administration, and political reach. For instance, a seal bearing the name of a 14th dynasty ruler might appear in a workshop hundreds of miles away, suggesting the king's influence extended beyond immediate territory. Yet the absence of large monuments, tombs, or temple inscriptions reminds us that these rulers operated under limitations unknown to later pharaohs. Their legacy survives in fragments, often discovered in dusty corners of modern museums or in sites long forgotten. The Delta itself, a fertile yet challenging region, shaped the 14th dynasty's governance. Its marshes, islands, and wide network of canals made control difficult, but also offered defensive advantages. Rulers could retreat to less accessible locations, regroup, and attempt to assert authority. Yet this same environment, combined with weak central oversight, allowed other powers to rise. Eventually, the Hyksos, another group of northern rulers, exploited these vulnerabilities, consolidating power and establishing their own dynasty. The 14th dynasty, once a regional authority, gradually faded into obscurity, leaving behind scattered artifacts and the faint traces in damaged king lists. Despite its obscurity, the 14th dynasty was significant for several reasons. It demonstrates that Egyptian history was not a linear succession of all-powerful pharaohs. Instead, it was a mosaic of localized authorities, competing interests, and regional dynasties that emerged in response to political, economic, and environmental pressures. The 14th dynasty, in particular, shows how the Delta served as a buffer zone, a place where rulers could test their authority and experiment with administration, far from the eyes of the southern kings and priesthood. These rulers, forgotten in later historiography, played a vital role in maintaining continuity during a period of political fragmentation. The mystery surrounding the 14th dynasty also highlights the challenges historians face in reconstructing ancient history. With so few records, scholars must rely on a combination of archaeology, comparative chronology, linguistic analysis, and educated inference. The result is a tentative reconstruction. Names on a papyrus here, a scarab there, a fragment of pottery with a ruler's inscription somewhere else. By connecting these pieces, historians can suggest the existence of dynasties, estimate the length of reigns, and infer political structures. But the work is ongoing, and new discoveries continue to shift understanding, reminding us that history is rarely fixed. For the people living under these northern rulers, life carried on despite the absence of grand monuments. Farmers cultivated wheat and barley along the Nile banks, Artisans crafted pottery and jewelry, scribes maintained local records, and priests continued ritual practices at temples dedicated to regional deities. The 14th dynasty's kings may not have been immortalized in the same way as the great builders of the Middle Kingdom, but their influence was tangible in everyday life, from grain storage to irrigation projects, from trade oversight to local judicial decisions. Ultimately, the story of the 14th dynasty raises broader questions about memory, legitimacy, and historical visibility. Why are some rulers remembered while others are forgotten? How much of Egypt's past has been shaped not by conquest, prosperity, or architecture, but by what later generations chose to preserve or omit? The lost dynasties, scattered through fragments and inscriptions, challenge the traditional narrative and invite us to consider history as a living, interpretive process rather than a fixed record. And so, as we leave the Delta behind and reflect on this shadowy dynasty, one is left with a lingering thought. How many rulers, like those of the 14th dynasty, lived, governed, and shaped lives for decades, only to vanish from memory, their names legible only in faint papyri, worn seals, and the smallest traces of mud brick walls? History, it seems, preserves not only what happened, but what we choose to remember, and in the case of Egypt's lost dynasties, memory itself is the most fragile artifact of all. After the shadowy northern rulers of the 14th dynasty had faded into obscurity, the political center of Egypt shifted decisively to the south, to the rugged banks of the Nile near Thebes. Here, in the heart of Upper Egypt, a new dynasty quietly rose. A dynasty whose kings are known to history only through fragments, damaged king lists, and the occasional scarab. This was the 16th dynasty, a line of rulers whose existence and exact reigns remain matters of intense scholarly debate. A dynasty that ruled during one of Egypt's most politically fragmented and turbulent periods. The 16th dynasty is sometimes overshadowed by the more famous Hyksos kings in the north, yet its significance cannot be overstated. While the Hyksos controlled Lower Egypt, Theban rulers maintained a precarious independence in the south, defending their territories, preserving local religious practices, and slowly building the foundations for a future reunification. In other words, they were quietly, patiently, and often invisibly preparing the stage for the eventual restoration of Egyptian unity under the 17th dynasty. The kings who almost disappeared. Unlike pharaohs of the Old or Middle Kingdoms, the kings of the 16th dynasty left few monumental inscriptions or grand tombs. Their names survive primarily in the Turin Canon, a papyrus list compiled centuries later, now badly fragmented. Some of these kings appear only as single lines, their reigns lasting perhaps a year or two. Others are missing entirely. One scholar estimates that of the 15 or so rulers likely belonging to the 16th dynasty, only about half are known by name. The rest are entirely lost, swallowed by the passage of time and political upheaval. Archaeological evidence adds tantalizing but incomplete detail. Excavations in Thebes have revealed administrative buildings, temples, and small cemeteries dated to this period. Pottery styles suggest continuity of local culture despite political instability. Seal impressions, bearing the names of 16th dynasty kings, indicate that officials were active in maintaining administration, taxation, and trade. These kings, though largely absent from the grand historical narrative, were nevertheless central to the daily life of Upper Egypt. The struggle against the Hyksos. The defining characteristic of the 16th dynasty was its constant tension with the Hyksos, a Semitic group that had settled in the Nile Delta and established a dynasty of their own, the 15th dynasty. The Hyksos had access to new technologies, including horse-drawn chariots, bronze weaponry, and composite bows, which gave them a military advantage. The Theban kings of the 16th dynasty had to defend their territories without comparable resources, relying on local knowledge, fortified settlements, and a decentralized strategy of resistance. Conflicts between the Thebans and Hyksos were not continuous pitched battles, but sporadic skirmishes, raids, and sieges. Texts later attributed to the 17th dynasty describe the hardships faced by southern Egyptians: villages destroyed, crops seized, and towns occasionally occupied. Yet these records also show remarkable resilience. Local communities maintained irrigation networks, continued religious observances, and ensured that temples remained active despite repeated disruptions. In many ways, the 16th dynasty was less about grand conquest and more about survival, perseverance, and slow, methodical resistance. Life in Thebes. During the 16th dynasty, while kings waged wars and defended borders, life in Thebes had a rhythm all its own. Farmers worked fields irrigated by carefully maintained canals. Craftsmen produced jewelry, pottery, and ritual objects for local temples. Scribes meticulously recorded land transactions, taxes, and offerings. The 16th dynasty kings, though politically constrained, oversaw these activities and maintained the administrative structure inherited from previous dynasties. In the absence of large-scale monumental projects, their rule was visible more in the management of day-to-day life than in massive construction. Religious life flourished under these rulers too. Temples dedicated to gods like Amun, Montu, and Khnum continued to function, often supported directly by royal decrees. Priests maintained rituals, and the kings themselves were involved in ensuring divine favor for their people. In some ways, the 16th dynasty represents a hidden continuity of ancient Egyptian traditions, an assertion that even when national unity falters, culture, religion, and bureaucracy endure. The problem of fragmentary records. One of the most frustrating aspects of studying the 16th dynasty is the scarcity and inconsistency of records. The Turin Canon, our primary textual source, is incomplete. Scarabs and seal impressions survive but are scattered, often discovered decades apart in different museum collections. Occasionally, inscriptions on small temples or private tombs offer tantalizing clues, but these are rare and often ambiguous. As a result, historians rely on conjecture, cross-referencing names and dates with evidence from the 15th and 17th dynasties to create a probable chronology. This fragmentary record has led to considerable debate among scholars. Some suggest that the 16th dynasty was a single unified line of kings ruling all of Upper Egypt. Others argue that multiple overlapping rulers may have governed concurrently in different regions. The lack of monumental inscriptions makes it difficult to determine how much power each king truly wielded. Were these rulers recognized across the entirety of Thebes and surrounding territories? Or did their authority extend only over a few towns and temples? The truth remains elusive. The importance of the 16th dynasty, despite, or perhaps because of its obscurity, the 16th dynasty is crucial for understanding Egypt's resilience. While the Hyksos dominated the north, the Theban kings ensured that Egyptian culture, religion, and administrative practices survived in the south. This continuity was not simply symbolic. It provided a foundation for the 17th dynasty, which would eventually defeat the Hyksos, reunite Egypt, and restore central authority. Without the 16th dynasty's persistence, the Second Intermediate Period might have ended with the permanent fragmentation of the country. In addition, the 16th dynasty provides a window into the everyday realities of a kingdom under pressure. It demonstrates how local rulers managed scarce resources, maintained legitimacy, and navigated relationships with powerful neighbors. Their story reminds us that history is not only shaped by the famous or the victorious, but also by those who endure, adapt, and quietly preserve institutions for future generations. The legacy of forgotten kings. Even without grand monuments, the 16th dynasty left traces that can still be seen. Fortifications in southern towns, small temples, pottery styles, and inscriptions in tombs all testify to their presence. Their survival through a period of northern invasion and political instability is remarkable. Though later Egyptian scribes often ignored them, focusing on dynasties that achieved grandeur or conquest, the 16th dynasty demonstrates that political influence and historical significance are not always visible in stone or gold. As scholars continue to study this period, new discoveries, fragments of inscriptions, seal impressions, or previously overlooked documents may alter our understanding further. The 16th dynasty's obscurity makes it one of the most fascinating cases of lost history, where the story is reconstructed slowly, like assembling a puzzle with missing pieces. Each new find has the potential to change how we perceive the Theban kings and their role in preserving Egypt during one of its most challenging periods. A reflection on memory and history. The 16th dynasty raises profound questions about how history is recorded and remembered. Many rulers lived, governed, and shaped lives for decades, yet they are known today only through fragments. Their names, often absent from monumental inscriptions or official king lists, remind us that history is selective, filtered by those who write it. Some rulers are celebrated, others, no matter how important in their time, disappear into obscurity. For the 16th dynasty, memory survives in small artifacts, local records, and the faint imprint of their administrative and religious decisions. It is a testament to human resilience, to the endurance of culture under pressure, and to the fact that even rulers largely forgotten by later generations played a vital role in shaping history. And so, as we leave the Theban kings behind, we are confronted with the same question that haunts the study of Egypt's lost dynasties. How many rulers, whose names and deeds never survived in grand monuments or public memory, quietly shaped the course of civilization and remain waiting to be rediscovered in the sands, papyri, and ruins of time? When we look back over Egypt's long, layered history, it is tempting to imagine a straight line. Pyramids rising, pharaohs reigning, dynasties succeeding one another in tidy order. But the reality is far messier, far more human, and far more fragile. The lost dynasties, the 14th, 16th, and others, including brief Kushite rulers, remind us that history is rarely orderly and memory is always selective. These dynasties existed in periods of political fragmentation, environmental stress, and external threats, yet they were vital in preserving Egyptian civilization during eras when the country might otherwise have fractured completely. The first lesson of Egypt's lost dynasties is resilience under pressure. Kings of the 14th dynasty managed northern towns and provinces, while more powerful neighbors controlled the delta. The 16th dynasty in Thebes preserved administration, religion, and culture, despite Hyksos incursions in the north. The Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty revived traditions that had been forgotten or abandoned. In every case, rulers acted not to conquer for personal glory, but to maintain stability, enforce law, manage resources, and ensure survival. They remind us that political success is not only measured by monumental achievements, but also by the ability to protect society's continuity during times of crisis. Second, these dynasties teach us about the fragility of memory. The fact that so many of these kings are known today only through fragments, scarabs, papyri, seal impressions, or damaged inscriptions shows how easily history can be lost. Egypt's official king lists omitted them, scribes neglected their achievements, and later historians often overlooked or ignored them. Yet without their careful governance, the reunification of Egypt under the 17th dynasty, or the preservation of cultural practices, might not have been possible. History is not merely what survives, it is what is remembered. And what is remembered is often incomplete, biased, and fragile. Third, these dynasties reveal the role of local power in larger civilizations. While we tend to focus on kings who built pyramids, led armies, or expanded borders, much of the work of governance happens quietly, locally, and practically. Irrigation canals, local courts, taxation of grain, temple rituals, and trade management were all essential to Egyptian survival. These responsibilities fell to rulers whose names are now obscure. The lost dynasties illustrate that even seemingly minor authorities can have profound impact, and that power is often exercised in ways that leave minimal evidence. Fourth, the lost dynasties highlight the complexity of human societies. Egypt, during the Second Intermediate Period, was not a monolith. Multiple dynasties could exist simultaneously, ruling different regions with varying degrees of authority. Some kings coexisted peacefully with neighbors, others clashed in small-scale warfare. Dynasties overlapped, alliances shifted, and the boundaries of power were fluid. This challenges our tendency to imagine historical kingdoms as centralized and orderly, reminding us that human societies are dynamic, unpredictable, and sometimes fragile mosaics rather than unified monoliths. The lost dynasties also demonstrate the importance of cross-disciplinary study in understanding history. Archaeology, papyrology, epigraphy, and environmental science all contribute to reconstructing these periods. Fragments of papyri in Turin, small scarabs in Cairo, pottery sherds in Avaris, and radiocarbon dating of mud brick layers together form a more complete picture. This multidisciplinary approach is vital because no single type of evidence can tell the full story. The lost dynasties survived in part because careful, patient research over centuries has slowly pieced together their narrative from scattered, incomplete records. Another lesson lies in cultural continuity. The Kushite pharaohs and Theban kings of the 16th dynasty maintained rituals, artistic styles, and religious practices that tied them to earlier periods. Even when central authority collapsed, the culture endured. Temples continued functioning, priests performed ceremonies, artisans produced familiar forms, and scribes preserved traditional scripts. These dynasties remind us that survival is not only about military might or political domination, but also about sustaining shared beliefs, practices, and knowledge that form the backbone of civilization. Equally compelling is the story of adaptation. The kings of these dynasties adapted to changing circumstances, political fragmentation, foreign invasion, environmental shifts, and resource scarcity. The 14th dynasty in the Delta leveraged waterways for defense. The 16th dynasty in Thebes managed limited resources under pressure from the Hyksos. The Kushites integrated Egyptian religious and administrative practices to legitimize their rule. Adaptation, more than sheer force, enabled these dynasties to endure and leave traces that survive even today. The study of lost dynasties also underscores human resilience in the face of obscurity. Many of these rulers lived, governed, and shaped lives for decades, yet were largely erased from memory. Their names were forgotten, their monuments lost or destroyed, their achievements minimized. And yet, their decisions, administrative skills, and leadership created a foundation for future dynasties, enabling the continuity of one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. Their impact survives not in grandeur, but in the small, practical acts of governance and preservation. Finally, reflecting on these dynasties raises philosophical questions. How much of history is lost to chance? How many rulers, scholars, and ordinary people contributed to the survival of civilizations without leaving a trace? What do we owe to those whose names never made it into stone or scroll, but whose labor, leadership, and resilience shaped our world? The lost dynasties remind us that history is not just the story of the famous, but the cumulative result of countless forgotten actors working quietly, persistently, and sometimes invisibly. In studying Egypt's lost dynasties, we are forced to confront the fragility of memory and the contingency of history. It becomes clear that the story of civilization is not always one of linear progress or visible triumph, but a complex interplay of resilience, adaptation, survival, and human ingenuity. Without the 14th, 16th, or 25th dynasties, the continuity of Egyptian culture could have been broken. Without rulers who persisted in obscurity, the temples, scribal practices, and cultural frameworks of Egypt might have been irrevocably lost. The dynasties we consider minor were, in fact, indispensable. As we close this journey through Egypt's lost dynasties, one lingering thought remains. The sands of time have swallowed entire reigns, obscure rulers, and forgotten kings. Yet the echoes of their decisions, struggles, and perseverance remain. Archaeologists, historians, and even casual explorers of history continue to discover fragments of their world. Each shard of pottery, each faded inscription, each recovered papyrus is a whisper from the past, a reminder that even the most obscure dynasties shaped the civilization that fascinates us today. So as you lay back and imagine those long-vanished rulers, Nubians restoring temples, Theban kings holding back northern invaders, Delta rulers quietly managing trade and grain, you are witnessing the legacy of resilience. The lost dynasties may never be fully known, but their stories endure in fragments, mysteries, and the faint heartbeat of a civilization that refused to disappear. And one final question lingers in the desert air. How many more kings, dynasties, and entire reigns lie hidden, waiting beneath sands, mud bricks, or ancient papyri, ready to remind us that history is always far stranger and far more delicate than we imagine?